The first time I set foot in the Teton Mountains, I had no idea what I was getting into. My partner, Mike, and I had been talking about taking a trip into the wilderness for months, and we'd chosen the Death Canyon Shelf as our destination, convinced it would be a good test of our skills. Little did I know it would test much more than just our skills. It would push us to our limits, both mentally and physically. The weather had a way of turning on us, catching us off guard every single time, and every day felt like a different battle against nature. We left the trailhead around dawn, our packs loaded with everything we thought we'd need. The sun was already high in the sky, and the air felt like it was going to crack under the weight of the heat. It was late September, so we were prepared for the usual crisp mountain nights, but I had no idea that we'd be seeing something much stranger. We had been hiking for a solid 4 hours, getting closer to the shelf, when the sky started to shift. At first, it seemed like just a few clouds moving in, but within minutes, they were rolling in fast, like dark, thick smoke. It was still sunny around us, but in the distance, the clouds were building up, dark and ominous. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The air shifted stale, heavy, and sharp, almost metallic. The smell of ozone hit me just as a distant rumble of thunder split the sky. Mike looked up, adjusting the weight of his pack. He was already nervous, but I could see the shift in him. His jaw was tight, his shoulders hunched. He always tried to stay calm, but when it came to bad weather, there was no hiding his unease. I felt it too, but I had learned over the years not to let fear take control. Then it happened. Lightning, a flash so bright it almost felt like the world had been flipped upside down. The crack of thunder was so loud it made the ground shake under our feet. We stopped dead in our tracks, looking at each other for a brief moment of silent understanding. The storm was coming fast, and we were at the mercy of it. I kept moving, trying to ignore the way the air felt charged, like something could snap at any moment. But we weren't fast enough. We found a flat spot for the tent, hurriedly pitching it just as the first raindrops began to fall. But it wasn't just rain. It was sleet. The temperature plummeted. We spent the next few hours in the tent, crouched low, trying to minimize contact with the ground. The storm wasn't letting up. If anything, it was getting worse. The air reeked of ozone, electric, sharp, like the very air itself was about to catch fire. I kept my back to the tent's walls, trying not to think about how exposed we were. The world outside seemed alive, thrumming with a dangerous energy. Lightning flashed, followed by the deafening roar of thunder, and I wondered if we were going to make it through the night. Mike, ever the optimist, kept saying it'd blow over soon. But I knew better. The night dragged on, each strike of lightning seeming closer, the thunder rumbling like a living creature right outside. The tent shook under the force of the wind, and I could feel the cold creeping in through the layers of my clothes. The storm was relentless, the world outside swirling in white flashes, the snow falling faster than I had ever seen. It wasn't until the storm passed that we realized just how much snow had fallen. For inches in just 30 minutes. The world outside had gone from wet and angry to a silent, cold white. The storm had come and gone, leaving us in the aftermath with no sign of the chaos we had just lived through. As we packed up the tent the next morning, I felt a sense of relief, but also unease. Nature had shown us its true face, and we'd barely made it out unscathed. The next stretch of the trip was just as grueling, though in a completely different way. The weather had cleared up, but the season was already late, and we were at a higher elevation. The temperature was still in the low 90s, a heat I wasn't expecting so far up in the mountains. We were reaching a pass above the tree line when Mike started to show signs of stress. His breathing was heavier, his pace slowing, and his face flushed with the effort of carrying a much heavier pack than mine. I kept a steady pace, but I could tell he wasn't doing well. His face was pale, and he was sweating too much for the dry air. I pushed him to drink more water, but it wasn't enough. We had been climbing for hours, and the pass was still ahead, but I noticed that Mike was becoming more and more sluggish. When I asked if he was okay, he just nodded, but I could tell he was trying to hide how bad things were getting. That's when I realized the streams we had marked on our map were all dry. I stopped at one, expecting a nice, cool source of water, but when I checked, there was nothing but dust and rocks. We kept moving, but it was starting to feel like we weren't going to make it much farther. Mike's dizziness was getting worse. His movements were slow, almost labored. I didn't want to risk it. There was a blue line marked on the map a mile ahead, and I needed to get water. So I told him to stay put while I moved ahead. I was hoping that the water source would be there, but I couldn't help but feel a sinking sense of dread. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I left Mike with the packs and started toward the marked location. The trail narrowed, the air thinner, and the dry heat didn't help. I moved quickly, my mind running through everything I could do to get back to him as fast as possible. I had to get the water. When I reached the stream, I dropped my pack and began to filter the water, my hands shaking from the effort of the climb and the heat. I was so focused on the task that I didn't notice the movement at first. A brown head popped up from the bushes across the stream, followed by another, and then another. I froze. A mama grizzly with her cubs. I've read every book, taken every class, and I knew exactly what I needed to do.
Standhalt.
Make noise, show no fear. But as I stood there, the reality of the situation hit me harder than any lesson could. I was completely alone. The nearest person was Mike, miles back, and the last hikers we'd seen were hours ago. There was no one else on the trail. I didn't move, just stood there, watching. The mother grizzly sniffed the air, but she didn't charge. I made noise loud and clear. I waved my arms, took a few steps back, but still, she didn't move. Her cubs were curious but stayed close to her, watching me. It was a standoff, me, standing on the bank of a stream, trying to appear as big as I could, and the grizzly and her cubs, deciding whether to cross. Time seemed to stretch on forever, the only sound the rustle of leaves in the wind. It felt like everything around us had gone silent. For a few moments, I honestly thought I might not make it out of there. But eventually, the bear mother sniffed the air again, then turned and led her cubs away. I didn't take my eyes off them until they disappeared into the brush. My heart was still pounding in my chest when I finally made my way back to Mike. His condition had worsened. He was dizzy and delirious from lack of water, but we had no choice but to keep moving. The rest of the trip felt like a blur of heat, exhaustion, and fear. Every day brought something new: hail, hypothermia, more lightning, and bears. We were lucky to make it out alive. By the time we reached the trailhead, I was drained, both physically and emotionally. The Tetons had taken everything we had to give. They showed us their beauty, their danger, and their power. But they also showed me something I'll never forget. No matter how much we prepare, nature will always have the upper hand. The storms, the bears, the isolation, it was all part of the mountain's character. And in the end, it was the mountains that had the final word. It was the best trip I've ever been on, but I'll never forget the feeling of raw fear that gripped me during that hike. Those moments where you're reminded that no matter how much you know or how strong you are, nature always has a way of keeping you humble. And on that trip, it didn't just teach me to respect the wilderness, it taught me to fear it. That night still haunts me every time I think about it, though it's been a few years now. It was an annual event that we, my search and rescue team, held every fall. We had our usual routine. Some light training, team bonding, and, of course, taking a few days off from the intensity of our work to refresh and regroup. But what happened that night wasn't the kind of thing I'd ever expected. The event took place in the mountains of Wyoming, far enough off the beaten path to make it feel like we were truly alone, but not so remote that we couldn't get help if needed. The autumn air was crisp, with the smell of pine and wet earth clinging to everything. The trees were just starting to change color, and the ground was soft with fallen leaves. A perfect setting, honestly, for our team to unwind and keep our skills sharp in a peaceful environment. We'd set up camp by a small, fast-moving creek that ran through the forest, which I always thought of as peaceful. The kind of place where you can listen to the water for hours if you're lucky enough to sit still long enough. That night, however, the creek turned into something more dangerous, something I'd never be able to forget. It started like any other training exercise. We were out late doing some night drills. The air had already started to cool, and the light from our headlamps cut through the shadows. My dog, Brody, an Australian shepherd, was leading the way. He was one of the most reliable dogs I had ever worked with, trained for both cadaver and man trailing. He was methodical in his work, following a scent trail with precision. We'd been training for several hours when Brody suddenly alerted to something in the darkness. His ears perked up, his nose to the ground, his body rigid. This wasn't normal. He was usually a calm, focused dog, so when he reacted like that, it meant we were onto something, possibly a real trail. I clipped the leash on him and began following him deeper into the woods. My teammates were spread out, maintaining a safe distance. The only sounds we could hear were the rustling of the trees in the breeze and Brody's breathing, heavy with focus. We walked for what seemed like miles, the trail leading us farther away from our base camp. The deeper we went into the forest, the darker and quieter everything became. Eventually, we found ourselves at the edge of a slick creek bed. The ground beneath me was soft, wet with the remnants of a recent rainstorm. The creek itself was louder here, rushing over rocks and fallen logs, the water dark and swift. I could see the faint glint of the moonlight on the surface of the water, but it barely illuminated the surrounding area. Brody's nose remained fixed to the ground as he led me toward the creek's edge. But the moment I took a step forward, I lost my footing. My boots slipped out from under me, and before I could even react, I was tumbling down the muddy slope. I hit the ground hard, my shoulders slamming into a rock before my body gave way completely. I slid uncontrollably toward the edge of the creek, and then nothing. My body was thrown over the side of the creek, and I landed with a sickening thud on a small cliff. My ribs cracked. I barely had time to feel the impact before the world went black. The pain was instant and overwhelming. My breath hitched in sharp gasps, my vision blurry and dizzy. I could feel the pressure on my ribs, the sharp sting in my skull from the concussion, and the cold of the ground pressing into my face. I remember trying to move, but everything hurt too much to even consider standing. I don't know how long I lay there before I managed to press the emergency alert button on my GPS. It's a small button that signals base camp when there's an emergency, either for rescue or to mark the location of a target. My hands were shaking, and I had to press it a few times before I felt the button to press. That's when the quiet set in. And then the footsteps. It started slowly, almost as if someone was hesitating, unsure of where they were stepping. But as the sound grew closer, I knew someone or something was out there. My mind raced. Was it one of my team members? Had they found me? My head swam. My vision still doubled as I tried to focus. I was so disoriented that it was hard to tell if I was imagining things, but the footsteps grew louder, and soon I could hear a voice. A man's voice. It wasn't a team member. It didn't sound like anyone I knew. The man spoke casually, almost as if he were giving a tour or telling a story. He mentioned how often people end up in the creek, how frequently people died from floods during hurricane season or tornado season. I couldn't make sense of it. There was something deeply unsettling about the way he talked, like he was too comfortable with death, too familiar with the idea of people not making it out of these woods. I could barely breathe, let alone respond to him, but I forced my eyes open, trying to see if he was with the team. I don't know why, but I felt a deep, gnawing fear in the pit of my stomach. There was something wrong with him. I couldn't explain it then, but I felt it now. And then, without warning, my dog Brody disappeared into the night. I don't know how he got away, but I was too out of it to chase after him. The pain in my ribs made it hard to breathe, and all I could do was lie there, hoping someone would find me soon. Then, just as the stranger took another step toward me, I heard something that made my blood run cold. It was Brody. His trills and hurry-up slowpoke bark echoed through the trees. The sound of his voice, sharp and impatient, was unmistakable. I could hear him moving quickly, closing the distance between us. The stranger stopped dead in his tracks. He turned his head to look toward the noise, his eyes narrowing in suspicion. I remember the way his gaze shifted back and forth between me and the direction of Brody's bark. And then, as if making a decision, he turned and began moving away from me, further into the woods. The sound of Brody's voice was joined by another bark, this one much deeper, more guttural. It was one of the other dogs from my team, a massive German shepherd named Ranger. The growl he let out was like nothing I had ever heard before. His hackles were up, his body poised and threatening. He wasn't alone. I could hear Brody now, his teeth bared and growling low in his throat. The dogs were ready to defend me, and I could feel that unmistakable sense of relief. The stranger didn't seem to know what to do. He looked back once more, just in time to see Ranger and Brody move into position, facing him with all the authority of a trained attack dog. His eyes widened, but he didn't make a move to run. Instead, he just stood there, watching. And that's when the real noise started. I could hear footsteps, but they weren't the creepy, slow shuffle of the man anymore. They were the fast, steady rhythm of my teammates. The former Marine officer, Mark, and the MMA fighter, Jack, were moving swiftly toward me, their heavy boots crunching on the ground. As they approached, Ranger and Brody continued to growl, their bodies taut with the energy of a potential fight. The man didn't budge. He just watched. Mark and Jack reached me within moments. They quickly assessed the situation, stabilizing me as best they could while still keeping an eye on the stranger. The dogs continued to watch him, their low growls rumbling deep in their chests. It was as if the dogs knew he was a threat long before I did. With the stranger still lingering in the background, Mark and Jack carefully helped me onto the backboard. I was barely able to breathe, but I didn't care as long as we were getting out of there. They wheeled me down to camp, the dogs still at the rear, their focus never leaving the stranger. At camp, the medical team cleared me after a quick assessment. My neck seemed fine, though I had broken a couple of ribs and was concussed. They insisted on sending me to the rural hospital for further evaluation, just to be safe. It was there, at the hospital, that I learned something that would stay with me forever. The nurse, an older woman with a kind face, mentioned that the area we had been working in had a high number of assaults, both physical and sexual. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up when I heard that. My heart sank. The man hadn't been a rescuer, and he sure as hell hadn't been lost. He was something far more dangerous. We filed a suspicious activity report with the police, but nothing ever came of it. As far as I know, they never found him, and I still have no idea what scent Brody was following. The trail didn't lead anywhere it should have, and we ended up far away from where the training had been set. Even now, I still think about that night. I don't know what would have happened if Brody hadn't returned when he did, if Ranger hadn't stepped in, or if Mark and Jack hadn't shown up when they did. But I know one thing for sure. That man was not out there by accident. He was waiting, and I'm certain that if Bro had always loved being alone in nature. There was something about the silence, the way the trees creaked in the wind, the way the world slowed down when you were far from the noise of cities. So, when I saw the forecast for a storm rolling in, I didn't think much of it. Sure, there were warnings of heavy rain and gusty winds, but it didn't sound like anything that would stop me. Besides, I'd been planning this solo camping trip for weeks, and I was tired of the city, tired of the noise. I was 29, and my dog, Max, a scruffy mutt I'd rescued a few years ago, was the only company I needed. I hadn't been to this campground before, but I'd heard it was peaceful, quiet, perfect for what I needed. The place was a little over an hour away from my home, tucked into a forested valley near the edge of the mountains. It wasn't far from the highway, but it was secluded enough that I wouldn't have to deal with other campers. That was the real appeal for me, just me, Max, and the wilderness. It had been a long time since I'd done something like this, and I was eager to disconnect, to turn my phone off, leave the world behind, even if only for a couple of days. I didn't realize how close the storm was when I left my apartment in the morning. The sky was gray, and the wind was picking up a little, but nothing that seemed too bad. I figured it would be a few light showers, some gusts of wind, nothing major. I was used to storms. I'd been caught in a few in the mountains before, but this time there was something different in the air, a heaviness. I shrugged it off as I loaded up the car and made sure Max had his leash, water, and food. The drive out was peaceful. There were no cars around, just the endless stretch of winding road, the occasional farmhouse, and the vast forested landscape that surrounded me. It wasn't until I reached the point where the signal cut out that I felt the first real sign of unease. I knew there were areas in the valley with poor reception, but I hadn't expected it to happen so quickly. I looked at my phone, the little no service icon glaring back at me. It wasn't a big deal. I wasn't planning to use it anyway. When I finally made it to the turnoff for the campground, the wind was picking up more. It wasn't anything crazy, but the trees were beginning to bend, and the first drops of rain started splattering against the windshield. Max had been lying quietly in the back seat, but he raised his head and stared out the window, his ears perked up. He didn't like storms. I tried to reassure him with a pat on his head before I drove down the narrow gravel road that led to the campsites. The campsite itself was beautiful, peaceful, tucked into the trees with a small creek running nearby. There was no one else around, which made me feel a little better. I found a spot by the creek, set up my tent, and unpacked my gear. Max sniffed around the campsite, tail wagging, clearly excited to be out of the car. I unpacked the stove and set about making a simple dinner. The rain had started coming down more steadily now, tapping lightly on the tent roof, but it wasn't anything I hadn't dealt with before. After dinner, I got into the tent, made sure Max was comfortable, and pulled out a book to pass the time while I listened to the storm pick up outside. I had no intention of letting it ruin my trip. It wasn't long before I started hearing the sound of the wind intensifying, the trees creaking, bending in ways that seemed unnatural. The storm was clearly growing stronger. I thought about the weather report I'd glanced at earlier, the warning about gusty winds, and realized I hadn't really paid attention to the specifics. Maybe I should have. As the night went on, the storm didn't let up. It only got worse. The wind howled through the trees, and Max started pacing inside the tent, his nerves clearly getting the best of him. I wasn't much better off. I tried to convince myself it was nothing to worry about, just a storm. I kept thinking about the road and the fact that there was no one else for miles. I'd seen the few cars on the way in, but they were long gone. The thought that I was completely alone, in the middle of nowhere, started to creep into my mind. The wind outside began to sound more menacing, like it was whispering through the trees, warning me about something. I shivered and zipped up my sleeping bag. I tried to push away the thoughts of being stuck out here alone, of a tree falling on the road and trapping me. I was being paranoid, Still, the more I thought about it, the more uneasy I became. The wind picked up again, this time with a howl so loud it rattled the tent. I tried to focus on the sound of the rain, the creek, anything that wasn't the wind. But every gust seemed to push the trees closer together, as if they were straining to break free of the storm. I checked my watch. It was late, but I knew I wouldn't be able to sleep. Max was restless now, and I could feel the tension in his body as he lay next to me. His breathing was shallow, his eyes wide with fear. He wasn't used to storms like this, and I didn't blame him. I wasn't used to it either. The wind was starting to sound more like a freight train now. I tried to ignore it, tried to tell myself it was normal, that I'd been through worse. But a little voice in the back of my mind was telling me to leave. I looked at the watch again. It was nearly midnight. I felt foolish, but something told me I couldn't stay here. The storm had only worsened, and the wind was so strong now that I could hear the trees creaking in ways they shouldn't. The last thing I wanted was to end up with a tree falling on the tent, or worse, on my car when I tried to leave. I knew I'd made a mistake coming out here, but I wasn't going to make it worse by waiting for something to happen. I grabbed the flashlight, packed up what I could, and decided to leave. The rain was pouring down hard now, the wind howling as I unzipped the tent and stepped out into the storm. Max was at my side instantly, his fur soaked through as I led him out toward the car. My heart was racing, the wind biting at my face, pushing against me like it was trying to keep me there. When I got to the car, the wind had picked up even more. The trees seemed to be swaying dangerously, and I thought for a moment that I might have made the wrong decision. But I wasn't about to stay out there alone with the storm raging like that. I threw everything into the back seat and started the car, the engine humming to life. As I drove down the narrow road, the rain was coming down in sheets, making it nearly impossible to see the road ahead. The wind was rattling the trees, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was going to fall. Something was going to block the road and trap me out here. I kept my eyes fixed on the road, my grip tight on the steering wheel. About 2 miles from the campground, my worst fear came true. A massive tree had fallen across the road, blocking most of it. My heart stopped for a moment, and I felt that rush of panic flood over me. The tree wasn't blocking the entire road, but it was big enough to make passing through difficult. The wind continued to howl around me, the storm showing no sign of letting up. I took a deep breath and inched forward, carefully navigating around the tree. My car barely fit between the branches and the edge of the road, but I managed to squeeze through. As I passed the fallen tree, I couldn't help but feel the sting of embarrassment. I had made the right call leaving, but still, there I was, driving in the middle of a storm, in the dark, with a tree just 2 miles away from where I'd been camping. I couldn't help but feel like an idiot. Max was lying on the seat beside me, still anxious but calmer now that we were moving. The storm wasn't getting any better, but at least I was on my way home. The adrenaline that had been pumping through my veins started to fade, replaced by that heavy feeling of regret. I had known the storm was coming, but I hadn't realized just how bad it would be. I put myself and Max in danger. As I made my way back, the trees swayed violently in the wind, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something might still happen. I finally made it back to the highway and felt the tension start to loosen from my shoulders. The road ahead was clear, and I was finally headed home. The storm raged on behind me, but I knew I wasn't going to make that mistake again. Next time, I'd listen to the warnings. And next time, I wouldn't be so eager to escape the world that I ignored the very real dangers of nature. I had been looking forward to this camping trip for weeks. It was supposed to be a quiet getaway, just me, my tent, and the fresh air. But that night, everything went wrong. The weather had been perfect all day, sunny with a light breeze, so I didn't think twice about driving out to a secluded spot I'd found on an online map. It was far from any busy trails, deep in the woods, a place I figured would be peaceful. But as night came, the sky changed quickly. The clouds grew thick and dark, and the air felt heavy, like it was about to rain. I hurried to set up my tent, but by the time I was done, the rain started coming down hard. The wind picked up too, making the trees sway and crack. I crawled into the tent, hoping the storm would pass soon, but it didn't. The rain hammered against the tent, and the wind howled through the trees. I thought about going back to my truck for shelter, but the trail was already getting muddy, and I didn't want to risk getting stuck out there in the dark. So I stayed put, listening to the storm roar outside. It felt like the whole forest was alive, groaning and shaking under the weight of the rain. Then I heard something. At first it was faint, but I could tell it wasn't just the wind. Something was moving outside my tent. The sound was different, rustling, like leaves and twigs breaking. It wasn't the usual sounds of animals. I froze, holding my breath, trying to listen. The noise got closer, like whatever it was walking toward me, its heavy steps crunching through the wet leaves. My heart pounded in my chest. I told myself it was probably just a deer or maybe a bear, but deep down I knew that was unlikely. I grabbed my flashlight, my hands shaking, trying to steady myself. I was about to shine it outside when the noise stopped. It went completely quiet. Not the calm quiet after a storm, but a heavy silence that felt wrong. I stayed still for what felt like hours, not daring to move. Every tiny noise, the rustling of leaves or the sound of the rain, made my pulse race. I didn't want to look outside, not knowing what was out there. The thought of seeing something I wasn't supposed to made me feel sick, so I stayed in the tent, not moving a muscle. Eventually, the rain slowed, and the wind eased up. It was still dark, but the storm seemed to be over. I knew I couldn't stay there anymore. The thought of whatever was out there, so close to me, was too much. I packed up my things slowly, trying not to make a sound. I knew I had to get back to my truck, but walking through the woods alone in the dark made my skin crawl. I finally made it to the trailhead, my heart racing the whole way. It felt like something was still watching me, following me. When I reached my truck, I threw my gear in the back, jumped inside, and locked the doors. I looked around, half expecting to see someone standing in the woods, but there was nothing, just the quiet, wet trees. The next morning, I went back to the campsite to grab the rest of my things. I wasn't sure why, but I needed to see the spot where I'd heard those noises. When I got there, I found the area where I'd heard the footsteps. The ground was soft and wet, and in the mud I found large footprints, way too big for any animal I knew. The prints circled around my tent, like whatever had been out there was watching me, waiting. But the weirdest part was that the tracks stopped right at my tent. There were no signs of anything moving away after that. It was like it just vanished. I didn't even stay another minute. I couldn't get out of those woods fast enough. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been out there, whatever had made those prints, had been waiting for me to leave. The storm had been bad, yes, but there was something else in those woods, something that didn't belong, something that was still there, following me even now. And as I glanced in my rearview mirror one last time, I couldn't help but feel like I wasn't alone on the road anymore. I decided to go camping for the weekend at my grandmother's old village. It was far from the city, and I thought it would be a quiet break from everything. The village had been in my family for years, and I felt a kind of bond with the place, even though I hadn't been there in ages. The village was very quiet and isolated, with just a few houses scattered between the woods and fields. My grandmother used to tell me stories about growing up there, and I always felt like there was something special about the place. I set up camp near a small stream that ran behind the village. There was an old, abandoned barn not far from the stream. The sun was just beginning to set, casting long shadows across the ground. I sat down by the fire, listening to the crackling of the wood, when I started hearing strange noises from a distance. At first, I thought it was just the wind rustling the trees, but the sounds kept getting louder, like footsteps crunching on the ground. It was too quiet, the kind of quiet where you can hear every little thing. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or something else moving through the woods, but then I heard something heavier, like boots stomping on gravel. I stood up, and the fire flickered, making the shadows around me stretch and shift. The barn was right there, dark and still, with its windows empty and cold. I thought I saw something move inside the barn. When I looked closer, it was gone. My heart started racing. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The sounds kept coming, but now they didn't feel random. They felt like they were following me, like something was waiting for me to make a move. I felt a cold sweat on the back of my neck, and the air around me seemed thicker, heavier. I grabbed my things and decided to go closer to the village. The camp was a little ways from it, about a quarter of a mile, but as I walked, the feeling of being watched got stronger and stronger. I remembered my grandmother's warnings from when I was a kid, how she always told me to stay away from the area near the barn after dark. I used to laugh it off, thinking it was just a story. But now, walking through the woods with the moon barely lighting the path, I wasn't so sure anymore. By the time I reached the village, I was on edge. Every small sound seemed too loud, too close. I walked to the house, an old stone building that had been standing for more than 100 years. The door creaked when I opened it, and I stepped inside, trying to calm my nerves. But something wasn't right. The air in the house felt different, colder and still, like it hadn't been touched in years. I checked the locks on the windows and doors, making sure everything was secure. But I could still hear the faint sound of footsteps outside. I wasn't sure if I was imagining it, but it didn't feel like it. After what seemed like forever, the sound stopped. I sat by the window, staring out at the village. The firelight from my camp was long gone, and the village was bathed in cold moonlight. Just as I started to relax a little, I heard a thud. It sounded like something heavy had been dropped near the barn. Then I heard something scraping, like metal being dragged across the ground. My body froze. I held my breath, listening, my heart pounding in my chest. I watched the barn through the window, but there was nothing, only darkness. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my stuff, grabbed my flashlight, and bolted out of the house. The village was too quiet now, too empty. I wasn't going to stick around and wait to find out what that sound was. I made my way back to my campsite by the stream, but when I got there, it was dead silent. Not a single rustle in the trees, no sound from the water, nothing. The whole place felt wrong. I started packing up my gear, trying to get out of there fast. That's when I saw it. A glint of metal in the darkness near the barn. I thought it was an old bucket or something, but then it hit me. My grandmother used to keep a lantern in the barn. It was always close to the door, hanging from a hook just inside. But there was no lantern there now. I wasn't about to stick around and find out what had happened to it. I packed up the rest of my stuff, my hands shaking, and grabbed my keys. I couldn't leave fast enough. My car felt like the safest place on earth as I drove away from the village. I still couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me, following me, even though I saw no one. My heart was pounding, and I couldn't get my mind to stop racing. Even though I never saw anything or anyone, the unease stayed with me. I kept looking over my shoulder, as if expecting someone to be right behind me. But when I glanced back, the road was empty. That whole trip, the feeling of being followed, of being watched, never left me. Couldn't shake it. I don't know if it was just the isolation or if there was something else going on in that village, but I knew one thing. I wasn't going back. When I got home, I told my family what had happened. They just looked at each other and nodded. Apparently, I wasn't the first one to feel that strange, suffocating feeling in the village. But no one could explain it, not really. They just said it was part of the land, something that had always been there. They told me to forget about it, that some things are better left alone. I don't know what I felt out there that night, but I know I won't be going back to my grandmother's village anytime soon. I don't know what it was, but I felt something waiting in those woods, something that had been there for much longer than me, something that didn't want visitors. And that thought alone kept me up for days after I left. There are places in this world that are better left untouched. And that village, it's one of them. It was supposed to be a peaceful camping trip. Just me and my sister, getting away from the noise of the city, surrounded by nothing but trees and quiet. We found a spot next to a small, clear stream, set up our tents, and started a fire. The evening was perfect, calm, and quiet. But as the night went on, something felt wrong. It wasn't the usual forest sounds. No birds, no rustling of animals. Just silence. Thick, heavy silence. I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just my mind playing tricks. But then I heard something. A snap of a twig. It was faint but clear, coming from deep in the woods, just beyond the firelight. My heart skipped a beat, but I didn't say anything to my sister. I tried to convince myself it was just a deer or some other animal, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. We sat by the fire for a while, both lost in our own thoughts. The sound came again, this time louder. It wasn't an animal. It sounded like footsteps, slow, heavy footsteps, crunching through the underbrush. I stood up, scanning the dark woods, but I couldn't see anything. My mind raced, trying to figure out what it could be. Then the wind picked up, and with it came a strange smell. It wasn't the fresh, pine-scented air I was used to. This smelled foul, like rotten meat. My stomach churned, and I could see my sister was uneasy too. We didn't speak, but I could feel it. She was scared. I told myself it was nothing. Probably just a bear, maybe even a mountain lion, though they don't usually come this close to people. But the feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. Then, out of nowhere, I heard it. A loud, dragging sound, like something heavy scraping along the ground. It was coming from deep in the forest, closer than before. My heart raced. This was no animal. I turned to my sister, telling her we needed to pack up. Something felt wrong. We grabbed our stuff and started shoving it into our backpacks, trying to be as quiet as possible. The dragging sound kept going, getting closer. My skin crawled as I heard the crunching of leaves and twigs, but now it was much closer. I didn't dare look, but I could feel whatever it was moving through the woods, staying right behind us. We finally made it to the edge of the forest, but I could still hear the heavy dragging. It was getting louder, closer. I couldn't see anything in the dark, but I could feel it, right behind us. I was almost at the car when I heard it. A low growl, so soft and deep, it made my chest tighten. It was close, too close. I didn't look back. We ran the rest of the way to the car, jumping in and locking the doors as fast as we could. We didn't speak a word as we sped down the dirt road. The headlights cut through the dark, but there was no sign of anything behind us. It felt like hours before we hit the main road, my hands still shaking. We didn't stop until we reached the nearest gas station, both of us exhausted and freaked out. I still don't know what it was. Maybe it was an animal, maybe something worse. I don't know, but the feeling of being hunted, of something following us, hasn't left me. I don't go camping like that anymore, not in the deep woods. I don't even know if I'll ever go back to a place like that. Whatever it was, it wasn't natural. And then there's the sound, that growl. I'll never forget it, but I sometimes wonder if it was just a warning. a warning that it was still out there, waiting. Because I've been hearing things at night, small noises in the woods behind my house. I don't know if it's just my mind playing tricks or if something's still following me. Either way, I'm not going back out there. Not ever again. It was one of those nights where the sky looked like it could break open at any moment. I was camping alone with my dog, Max, deep in the woods. I wasn't expecting anything special, just wanted some quiet, away from the noise of the world. But the rain came down hard and fast, non-stop. It slammed against the tent, making a constant, pounding sound that almost drowned out everything else. Max wasn't bothered by the rain. He curled up in his usual spot, a few feet away from me, breathing calmly in the stillness of the night. I tried to focus on the sound of the rain and the wind blowing through the trees, but something felt off. I couldn't explain it, but every few minutes, I felt a chill run down my spine. I tried to shake it off. It was probably just the quiet getting to me. I had just started to drift off to sleep when Max suddenly stood up, ears up, alert. I sat up fast, my heart racing. He was staring out into the dark, his body stiff. I held still, not moving a muscle. At first, I thought maybe it was just a small animal, something harmless. But then I heard it. Footsteps, soft but steady, crunching the wet leaves just outside the tent. They were too slow, too purposeful. Max let out a low growl, the kind he always made when something wasn't right. I stayed as quiet as possible, trying not to make a sound. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, everything went completely silent. My heart pounded in my chest as I listened, straining to hear anything that could explain what was happening. The rain kept pouring, the only sound other than the blood rushing in my ears. Then came a rustling, louder now, way too close. I grabbed the flashlight next to me, my hands shaking as I tried to quietly flick the switch. Max's growls grew deeper, more worried. I didn't know what it was, but it wasn't any animal I knew. There was something wrong about this. The rustling grew louder, getting even closer. Then I heard breathing, slow, shallow, uneven, coming from just outside the tent. My mind raced. Who the hell was out there? And why weren't they using a flashlight? Suddenly, Max snapped, barking loudly, and the breathing stopped. My hand was shaking as I held the flashlight, its beams slicing through the blackness outside the tent. I didn't dare look out. The hair on my neck stood up, my body frozen with fear. For what felt like forever, I waited. The footsteps slowly moved away, at first, then picked up speed, retreating into the dark. I wasn't about to stick around and find out who or what was out there. I grabbed Max's leash, pulling him close, and hurried out of the tent. The rain was pouring harder than ever, but I didn't care. I just had to get out of there. Max stayed by my side, still on edge, and we moved as fast as we could through the wet, slippery woods. I didn't stop running until I reached the trailhead, my heart still pounding. I couldn't hear much over the rain, but I knew whatever or whoever had been out there had followed me. They were close, just out of sight, always making sure I knew they were there. The thought made my stomach turn. But when I saw the lights of the parking lot in the distance, I finally felt a bit of relief. I wasn't staying in that forest a minute longer. As I loaded Max into the car, I glanced back toward the woods. The rain was still falling hard, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever it was, whatever it was still out there, waiting. It felt like I hadn't been alone for a second since I set up camp. My gut twisted with fear, knowing someone had been watching me the whole time, waiting for the right moment. I couldn't stop the feeling that whatever had been following us was still out there, lurking in the dark, just beyond the trees. I glanced at Max, who had his eyes trained on the forest as well, his ears flat against his head. I started the car and looked back one last time. The night was still and silent, the rain pounding the earth. But something didn't feel right. Something about the way the forest stood there, so quiet, made my skin crawl. As I drove away, I kept checking the rearview mirror. I had the feeling that whatever it was, whoever it was still out there watching, waiting for the next time I'd come back. But I wouldn't be back. I wasn't going anywhere near that forest again. Something in those woods had marked me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't just leaving the forest behind. It felt like it was following me, a dark presence that had been with me all along. That night, I learned that some places don't just let go. They keep a piece of you, and no matter how far you go, that piece stays behind, waiting in the shadows.